Nora stood knee-deep in the wreck of her own cornfield. In a whole crop of green stalks split, flattened, and pressed into the mud by an hour of hail. The night before, that field had been the best stand she had put in since she took the farm on alone, the ears filling in the dough and 3 or 4 weeks from a silage cut. Then the storm came out of the west on a green July evening and took the county's corn in under 20 minutes. She had stood on the porch step and watched the hail fall in white sheets. It hammered the tin roof of the barn until she could not hear the dog barking beside her. She had let herself be proud of that corn. Pride, she would think later, was the first thing the storm broke. Then the ice stopped, and the light came back, gray and dripping. Every stalk she owned lay flattened in the mud. The leaves were shredded to green ribbons. The stalks were bent and split at the knuckle. The young ears had been knocked to the ground and burst open. She walked out while the hail was still melting in the furrows, and there was no sound in the field but running water. Weeks from the chopper, and the whole of it lay pulped. She stood in the middle of the ruin and did the arithmetic she did not want to do. That corn had been the winter. It was to be chopped and stored, to carry her small herd from the first hard frost to the first green of spring. 14 head of cattle stood at the far fence, tails to the wind, waiting to be fed. Without the corn, she had nothing to put in front of them once the grass died. She knelt and picked up a broken stalk. It was still alive in her hand. The cane was juicy where it had cracked. The leaf pulp was bright and wet. The whole plant was heavy with the water it had drunk all summer. It was not dead. It was only ruined. There is a difference, though most people never learn it, and that difference was the only thing she had left. She had taken the place over 3 winters back when her father could no longer climb into a tractor. Everyone had expected her to sell. A young woman, alone, on ground that had never made anyone rich, was supposed to know better. She had stayed instead. She had made it pay a little, year on nothing but long days and a short temper toward waste. Waste was the thing Amos had taught her to hate. Her grandfather had farmed the same ground through years far leaner than this one, and his one rule was that a farm throws nothing away that an animal can still use. The corn was to have been the proof that she could carry a herd on her own feed. Now it lay in the mud, and the whole county would have an opinion about what she did next. By morning the news had gone up and down the gravel roads. The hail had walked the length of the county's corn ground, a wide gray swath through every good field on the bottoms. Nora drove the section line at first light to see how far it reached. Field after field lay knocked flat, every one of them shining and wet and worthless. She was not the only one wiped out. She was only the one with the least behind her to fall back on. The insurance man came out 2 days later in a clean truck. He walked the edge of her field without stepping into the mud, wrote on a pad, and gave her a number that would not buy a winter's worth of hay. Total loss, he called it. He told her to disc it under, plow the trash back into the dirt, and start fresh in the spring. That was the sensible thing. That was what everyone up the road was already doing. Harlan farmed the big acres on the west side, and he had lost more corn than anyone. She watched from her fence as his tractor pulled the disc through the ruined stalks, turning the green wreck under and burying it. He saw her watching and shook his head. A ruined crop was a ruined crop, his look said. You buried it, you swallowed the loss, and you did not make a fool of yourself over garbage. Boyd, who rented the ground beside him, was already burning his in a wet, smoking pile. Nora went home and did not disc anything. She sat at Amos's old kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and let herself be afraid for 1 full hour. Then she got up, because fear does not feed cattle, and she went looking for the one thing she half remembered. He had kept every feed record in his own square handwriting on a shelf she had never had the heart to clear. Somewhere in them was a lean-year trick she had heard him tell only once. She found it near the bottom of the stack in a ledger soft at the corners. The winter the drought broke with a hailstorm, he had written, "We did not lose the corn. We cut it green off the ground and packed it away sweet." The page went on in his short, plain hand. "Chop the whole plant while the water is still in it. Pack it down hard so no air can live inside. Cover it and weigh it and leave it be. In 3 or 4 weeks it turns, and it keeps till you need it." What Amos had made, without ever using the word, was silage. Nora had heard the word at the co-op, spoken about the big dairies with their concrete bunkers and their loaders. She had never thought of it as something a small woman could do alone in a wrecked field. But the science under it is old and stubborn, and it does not care how much money you have. Green forage, chopped fine and packed tight enough to shut out the air, does not rot. It ferments. The natural sugars in the plant feed a bloom of bacteria. Those bacteria turn the sugars to acid. The acid pickles the whole mass and locks it, dropping it below the sour line where rot cannot live. Sealed away from oxygen, it will hold its feed value through the coldest winter there is. And a cow does not care that a leaf was torn by hail. She eats the whole chopped plant, leaf and cane and broken ear together. The very thing that had made the corn worthless to a man, the shredding and the splitting and the knocked-down ears, made no difference at all to the animal it was grown to feed. If anything, the hail had done half her chopping for her. The wreck in the field was not garbage. It was a silage crop that had already been cut down. But the old ledger was clear about one thing, underlined twice. It had to be done fast. Downed green corn does not keep. In the heat it wilts and heats, the field molds move in, and the sugar the ferment needs bleeds away as it dries. Get it cut and sealed while the sap is still in it, Amos had written, a day or 2 at the most before the weather turns it. Nora read the line and felt her stomach drop. She had already burned one of her 2 days being afraid. If she wanted this feed, she had a day and a half to cut, chop, and bury a whole field before the heat took it. He had left the fussy parts, too, the parts that decide whether a pit keeps or kills. The green had to be wet but not soaked, about 2/3 water, so it packed dense and soured clean. Too dry and it would trap air and mold. Too wet and it would turn slick and rank and no animal would touch it. He had written how to test it in your fist, how to build it in thin layers, how to crush each one down before you laid the next. He had even set the reason down under the rule so she would trust it when her arms begged her to quit. Air fed the rot, pressure starved it. Every pass of the tractor was another day of winter bought. She read the pages twice by lamplight until the plan stood clear in her head, then slept 4 hours because there was nothing left of the day. If you have ever stood in front of a ruined year and been told by everyone who matters to give it up, you already understand the next part of this. Sometimes the only sane move is the one they are laughing at. If a story like this is the kind you want more of, quiet work and hard winters and people who bet on themselves, then follow along, because that is the only sort we tell here. She started before the sun was fully up. The old pull behind Chopper had sat under the shed for years since Amos stopped cutting his own feed. It took her half the morning and all of her patience to get it turning. She greased the bearings, She freed the rusted knives one at a time. She bolted a torn belt back together twice. When it finally bit into the first flattened row and threw a stream of chopped green into the wagon, she almost sat down in the dirt from relief. Then it was only work, and there was no end to it. The stalks lay every direction, knocked flat and tangled, and a chopper wants its corn standing. She raked windrows by hand where the machine could not reach. Dragging the wet cane into lines the pickup head could swallow. She set the header high to keep the knives up out of the dirt, because a chopper that eats mud packs grit into the feed, and grit is one more thing a cured pit will not forgive. Even so, she lost a share of the flattened crop to the ground and let it go. A field this far down never chops clean. The pulp coated her gloves and her sleeves and the whole front of her worn canvas jacket. Her back locked up before noon. She ate a sandwich standing in the field and did not stop. An hour past midday, the chopper choked and died. A knot of tangled cane had jammed the feed rollers solid, and the shear bolt had snapped clean off to save the gears. She lay under the machine in the mud and dug the wad out by hand, cutting her knuckle on a knife edge. There was no spare bolt of the right size in the shed. For a long, sick minute she thought the whole gamble would end there, beaten by a part worth less than a cup of coffee. Then she remembered a coffee can of odd bolts on Amos's workbench. She found one close enough, filed it to fit, and had the knives turning again before the sweat had dried. She lost 40 minutes she did not have. The window did not care about her bad luck, and neither did the sun. Boyd drove by on the road twice and slowed both times to watch her chop a field everyone else had already written off. She could see him grinning under his cap. By afternoon, 3 of them stood at the fence line, Harland and Boyd and a younger man, leaning on the wire like men who have decided the show is free. They called across the field that she was baling trash. They said it would mold. They said she would poison what few cattle she had left and finish the job the hail had started. She did not answer them. She kept the chopper moving. The heat was the real enemy worse than the mockery. The day after a hailstorm can turn hot and still, and it did. Every hour the sun lay on the downed corn, it pulled water and sugar out of the wreck and moved her window closer to shut. She worked through the middle of the day when a sensible person would have rested. Sweat ran under the camo cap and stung her eyes. She tied her hair back, pulled her collar up against the chaff, and drove the field in long, aching passes. By dusk of the first day, her hands had stopped feeling like hands and become tools she could no longer quite feel. The chopped green rode in the wagon behind her, cool and heavy, smelling of cut grass and sap. She kept catching that smell and reading it like a page. It was the smell of a thing not yet spoiled, and every load she saved from the sun was a load the winter could not take from her. She worked until she could not see the rows, and then she worked by the tractor lights. By the end of the first day she had a wagon and a half of chopped green and a trench half dug. The pit was the other half of the trick, and she had chosen the spot with care, on a slope where water would drain away from it rather than into it. She ran the old backhoe until dark, cutting a long channel into the hillside, wide and shallow-walled with a ramp at one end so she could drive the tractor in to pack and back it out again without ever risking a tip. Air was the thing she had to beat. The tighter she packed the chopped corn, and the faster she sealed it, the less oxygen would be trapped inside to spoil it. She slept 4 hours and was back at it before light. The second morning was a race she could feel in her teeth. She chopped and hauled, and between loads she spread each wagon into the pit in thin layers. Emma's had been firm about the layers. A pit filled in one dumped heat breeze and heats and sours from the middle out. A pit built a hand's depth at a time, each layer crushed before the next, goes down dense and sleeps clean. So she spread it thin and drove the tractor back and forth over every layer again and again, crushing the air out. She tested the green in her fist, as the ledger said, squeezing a handful hard and watching how it broke. If it dripped between her fingers, it was too wet. If it sprang open, dry, and loose, it wanted more moisture than a cut field could give it. Being all one field taken down in a single green rush and caught in the dough while the sap was still up, most of it ran just right, cool and heavy and holding its shape. A whole field cut at once does not leave a person much to correct. It ran even and wet, without the dry patches a standing crop drying on the stalk would have given her. It was slow, fussy, filthy work, and no one but a dead man had ever told her it would matter. She believed him anyway. She had watched Amos be right too many times to bet against his handwriting now. The pit swallowed everything she could feed it. A whole ruined field goes into a smaller hole than a person would guess once the air is driven out of it, and driving the air out was the labor that never ended. She packed in the heat of the day and packed again by lamplight until the green lay in the hillside dense as wet bread. When she climbed down at last, her legs would barely hold her. But the pile was tight, and tight was the only thing that mattered. Layer by layer the trench filled, dark green and glistening, smelling of cut cane and sap. The chopped hail corn packed down better than she had feared, wet and heavy and dense. She weighted the tractor bucket and rolled it over the pile until the surface went firm under the tires. Her arms shook on the wheel. She had stopped being able to tell the ache in her shoulders from the ache behind her eyes, and still she packed. A half-sealed pit was the same as an open one, and an open one was worthless. The men came back on the second afternoon, drawn by the strangeness of it. This time Vernon was with them, the oldest farmer on the road, a man who had ridden out more bad years than the rest of them put together. The younger ones laughed and pointed at the green mound growing in her hillside. Vernon did not laugh. He stood a little apart, chewing the corner of his mouth, looking at the pit with a slow, careful frown, as if a word he had not thought of in 50 years were working its way up from the bottom of his memory. She sealed it as the light failed on the second day. This was the part Amos had underlined last. Cover it so no rain and no air can reach it. She had bought a roll of heavy black plastic sheeting on credit at the co-op, and she pulled it over the whole packed length of the trench, tucking the edges into the dirt and weighting the seams. Then she went down the fence line, collecting every old tire on the place, and she laid them across the plastic edge to edge, a black scaled skin holding the wreck down against the wind. When the last tire was down, it was full dark, and the 2 days were spent almost to the hour. She stood at the head of the trench with a flashlight and looked at what she had made. A long, low, black-skinned mound in the side of a hill holding a whole ruined field. It looked like a grave. Every neighbor who had seen it thought it was one. She turned off the light and let herself believe, for the length of one breath, that her grandfather had known something the insurance man did not. Then the waiting started, and the waiting was harder than the work. There was nothing to do to the mound now but leave it alone, and leaving a thing alone when your whole winter depends on it is its own kind of labor. Inside the sealed pit, In the dark and the wet and the total absence of air, the ferment was supposed to be catching. The bacteria were supposed to be waking in the sugar, turning it, souring it, dropping the whole mass into a pickled sleep. She could not see any of it. She could only wait, count days, and trust an old man's handwriting. The first week, the pile heated. She could feel the warmth off the plastic when she laid her hand on it in the morning. For 2 bad nights she was sure she had failed, that it was rotting instead of curing. But Amos had warned of that too. A little heat at the start is the pack breathing out its last air, he had written. Too much heat is death. She had no thermometer she trusted, so she went by her palm. The warmth rose, and then, around the 7th day, it began to fall. It was souring, not burning. It was doing just what the ledger promised. 3 weeks in, a hard fall wind rolled a tire off one corner and worked the plastic loose, and she did not catch it for the better part of a week. By the time she found the lifted corner on an evening walk, the air had been feeding on that shoulder for days. She pinned the sheet flat, weighted it double with 2 more tires, and lay awake the rest of the night with the wind at the window. In the morning, she dug a careful hole into that shoulder to see how far the harm had gone. A hand's depth in, the corn had turned gray and slimy and sour, spoiled by the days of air it had drunk through the open corner. The smell of it was nothing like the sweet reek deeper down. It was the smell of failure, and it had come from a single tire left to the wind. She cut the spoiled pocket out with a fork and a hard heart, hauled the gray mess off to rot where it could do no damage, and resealed the wound tight. It cost her a wheelbarrow of feed she could not spare and a lesson she did not forget. Air was not a thing you beat once and forgot. Every seam, every edge, every rolled-off tire was a door, and the pit would take its tax at any door left open. From then on, she walked the whole black skin of it each evening at dusk, hands out, feeling for a lifted corner before the wind could find one first. She came to know the pit as you come to know an animal. She learned where it liked to lift, which seam caught the north wind, how the surface sweated on a warm afternoon and drew tight on a cold one. On still evenings she would press her hand flat to the cool plastic and feel the pack settled and firm beneath it, and know the ferment still held without ever breaking the seal to look. It was her whole winter sleeping in a hillside. She came to trust it as she trusted the weight of a full feed sack in her arms. Word of the crazy woman and her buried corn went around, and it grew as it went. Down at the sale barn they said she had lost her nerve when she lost her crop. They said she had gone and pickled a field like a jar of beans and expected cattle to eat it. Boyd told it best with his hands and got a laugh every time. Only Vernon, at the edge of the coffee table, did not join in. Once he said, to no one in particular, that he thought he recalled his own father doing something not far from that in a hard year. Nobody listened. The story was funnier the other told. Meanwhile, the price of feed began its slow, mean climb, as it always does after a wreck. With the county's corn buried or burned, everyone would be buying hay to fill the hole, and everyone knew it. At the first cutting, a good round bale had gone for $40. A month on, the same bale cost $60, and the man who hauled it said he could not promise the price would hold. The co-op felt it too. The sacks of range cake and the good protein pellet went first, and then the plain ground corn, until the shelves along the back wall stood half bare by September. A man who had laughed at her in July stood in that aisle running the same arithmetic she had run, and finding no better answer in it than she had found. Nora sat again at the kitchen table with a pencil. To buy her way through the winter on hauled hay at prices still rising would take more money than the farm had ever cleared in a good year, let alone this one. She did not open the pit to check it, though the wanting to nearly beat her. She knew from the ledger that opening it early would let the air back in and undo the whole cure. A silage trench has to stay sealed until it is done, and until you mean to feed it, because every hour of oxygen at the face is an hour of spoilage. So she left it shut through the tail of the summer and into the fall. She watched the grass in her pasture go from green to gold to gray. She counted her cattle every evening. And she held her nerve. Fall came on hard and early. The pastures that had carried the county's herds all summer went short and then went bare. The disked fields, Harlan's included, grew nothing but volunteer weeds and a thin flush of green that a killing frost took in a night. The men who had buried their corn had bought their winter on faith and a rising hay market, and the market kept climbing. When the first real cold came down, a round bale that had cost $40 in July was bringing better than 90, and the hayman had stopped answering some of his calls. Nora fed the last of her standing pasture down to the dirt and knew the day had come. The grass was finished. The cold was in the ground. If the pit had failed, she would find out now, with no time left to buy her way out of it and no money to try. She walked out to the black mound in a hard gray wind with a fork and a feeling in her chest like standing at the top of a ladder. 14 head watched her from the lot, ribs beginning to show, breath smoking. She rolled the first tires off the plastic. She peeled back the sheeting at the near end. And she cut into the face of the pile. The top few inches under the plastic had gone dark and crusted. The little cover always gives up at the very surface. She forked that thin skin aside and set it well clear of the cattle. Then her fork went in under the cap, and the smell that rose up out of the green stopped her cold. It was not rot. It was sweet and sharp and clean, a bready, tangy, cured smell like a barn full of good pickle. Under the dark, weathered skin of the surface, the corn was bright green. It had held. The whole ruined field lay there packed and sweet and preserved, leaf and stalk and burst ear, every torn ribbon of it turned to winter feed. She stood with a forkful of it lifted in the gray light and let out a breath she felt she had held since July. She carried the first fork of it to the fence and pitched it over to the herd. The old red cow reached it first. She smelled it, mouthed it, and then began to eat in long, greedy pulls. The black cows crowded in beside her, and in a minute all 14 head had their noses down in the green and were eating like they had not eaten in weeks. Nora leaned on the fork and watched them feed, and something behind her ribs came loose at last. "Easy," she said to the red cow, low, the first word she had spoken aloud in days. "There is plenty. There is a whole winter of it." She did not trust it on faith alone. Hail bruised corn cut green can carry mold, and corn stressed and taken early can hold nitrate enough to hurt a cow. So before she made the green her herd's whole ration, and long before she sold a pound of it to anyone, she carried a sample to the county extension office and had it tested. It came back clean, low in nitrate, and free of the bad molds, safe to feed. Only then did she turn the cattle loose on it. The cattle ate, and over the next weeks they did the thing that no argument could have done for her. They gained. The silage carried the weight of it, and the little bought grain she could now afford to spread on top put the last of the condition and shine on them. Their coats came in thick and bright. The thin ones filled out along the ribs and the flank. A cow in the dead of winter, on feed the whole county had called poison, put on condition where anyone could see it. There is no witness like an animal in good flesh. You cannot fake it, and you cannot argue with it, and every man who drove past her lot could read it at a glance. The old red cow had come into winter the thinnest of the lot, an aging thing Nora had half expected to lose before spring. By February she carried a bloom on her coat and a set to her hip that a young cow would have envied. That single animal, fat and shining on feed the county had called poison, argued the case at the fence better than any word Nora could have said. People came to look the herd over, and they left quiet. Vernon was the first to come to the fence, and he came alone. He stood a long while watching the herd eat, then pushed his cap back and said what the others would not. "That is silage," he said. "My father made it the once, the year the creek dried. I was a boy. I had near forgot the smell of it." He looked at her. "You cut that whole hailed field green and packed it, did you not?" 2 days, Nora said. Granddad left the trick of it in his book. Vernon nodded slowly, like a man watching an old debt come due. "They laughed at Amos, too," he said. "Right up until the winter he was the only man on the road with fat cattle. Folks forget. You will find they forget this by spring, and be glad to. The others came after him, because that is how it goes. They came 1 and 2 at a time, hands in their pockets, and looked over the fence at 14 head in hard flesh, while their own cattle stood in bare lots, gnawing $90 hay down to the string. Nobody laughed at the wire now. A man cannot laugh and count another man's fat cattle at the same time. They asked their questions sideways, as proud men do, and she answered them plain. And the green kept coming off the cut face, sweet and endless. She did not lecture them. She showed them the fist test at the open trench, how the good green sprang back and smelled of pickle, how the thin spoiled skin came away gray and went onto the scrap heap well clear of any animal's reach. She told them what Amos had told her, that a farm keeps whatever an animal can still use, and that the sky can ruin a crop without ruining its feed. Some of them heard it standing right there. Most of them only truly heard it the following winter, when their own corn went down. The younger man who had leaned on her fence in July came back in December and could barely get the words out. His father was down to nothing, he said, and would she consider selling some? She told him to bring a trailer. He thanked her twice and looked at the ground, and she let him keep what was left of his pride, because taking it would have cost her nothing and helped no one. The hay market broke bad just after the new year, as she had known it would. The cold clamped down and did not let go. The last cuttings ran out. A round bale that had brought $90 in the fall could not be found at $140, and then was not to be had at all. Cattle across the county started going hungry in earnest, and Nora stood at the head of a hillside trench still better than half full of feed that had cost her a roll of plastic on credit, a tank of diesel, a mended bolt, a share of the crop lost to the mud, and every muscle she owned. Set against a winter of hay she could not have bought at any price, it was the cheapest feed in the county. It had not been free, but it had been hers to make. Boyd came to her fence on a bitter afternoon with his cap in his hand, which she had never once seen. His cattle were in trouble, and everyone knew it. He stood at the wire, could not quite look at her, and asked in a low voice whether she might have any of that green to sell. "I might," Nora said. She let the wind blow between them for a moment. "It is $160 a ton, same as I would charge my own brother if I had one." He did the arithmetic she had done in July. A ton of wet silage did not go as far as a ton of dry hay, and she had set her price knowing it. Even so, weighed against hay that could not be found at any price, her grain was the cheaper feed by a long way. It was not charity, and it was not robbery. It was the plain truth of what the winter was worth, and he knew it. He nodded and said he would bring the trailer in the morning. She could have asked far more. She knew it, and he knew it. A trench of feed in a county of starving cattle could have been priced at whatever a desperate man would pay, and there were men that winter desperate enough to pay near anything. Some offered before she named a figure. One man from the far side drove up and said he would give 200 a ton. Cash. If she would sell him the whole pit at once and let his neighbors fend for themselves. Nora told him no. She had read Amos's ledger long enough to know which lean year men were remembered kindly, and which were remembered another way. She set a fair figure, and she held it. She did not raise it by $1, no matter who drove up the lane or how badly they wanted the whole of it for themselves. They came all through the deep of the winter. Boyd first, then the younger men, then farmers from 2 roads over who had only heard about the woman with the buried corn. She sold the green by the trailer load off the open cut, keeping the face tight and feeding straight across it so the air never got ahead of her. The line of trucks at her fence on a selling morning was a thing the county talked about for years, though she never once thought of it as a triumph. It was only feed, changing hands at a fair price, in a winter that had left most people with none. Harlan came last, because pride is the slowest thing to thaw. He drove in on a still, cold morning near the end of February with a trailer of cattle so thin she winced to see them. He had buried his corn in July and mocked her for saving hers, and now his herd was failing and he had run out of every other door to knock on. He got out of the truck and stood at her fence a long moment, looking at the black mound and at her bright-coated cows. And whatever he had planned to say went out of him. "I buried mine," he said finally. It was not quite an apology. From Harlan it was closer to one than anyone on that road had ever heard. Plowed a whole crop under and called you a fool for keeping yours. "You did the sensible thing," Nora said. Everybody did. She looked at his sorry, hungry cattle and then back at him. "The price is $160 the ton, Harlan, same as I gave Boyd. Bring your trailer up to the pit. Your cattle do not care whose corn it was." He looked at her a moment as though he had come braced for gloating and could not find any to push against. "You would have been within your rights to charge me double," he said. "I would have," she said. "I would rather be owed a good turn than a grudge. Pull up to the trench." He bought a load and then another the next week, and the green off her ruined field carried his herd to spring alongside her own. She never gloated. She never had to. The feed did the talking, as Amos had always said the right feed does, and every load that went out over her tailgate said the same quiet thing to the man who hauled it. Spring came slow that year, as it does after a killing winter, but it came. The trench emptied out at last down to the clean dirt of its floor. It had carried 14 head and better through the worst of it, with feed to spare and sold. Nora turned her cattle out onto the first green pasture in April, and they walked out onto it sleek and strong and heavy, the best conditioned herd on the road, out of a crop the whole county had watched the sky destroy. She never dug that hillside for a pit again, and she prayed she would never see another hail like the one that had started it. But she kept the black plastic folded in the shed and a tire stacked beside it. She kept the old ledger on the kitchen shelf where she could reach it, because a thing worth knowing in a lean year is worth keeping against the next one. The county remembered too. The next time Hale walked through green corn, there were 3 trenches going in before the insurance man had finished his coffee, and every man who dug one had once leaned on her fence and laughed. Vernon had been right about the forgetting and right about the gladness. Nobody thanked her out loud. They just did as she had done, which is the only thanks a farm ever really gives. She walked out to Amos's grave that spring with nothing to say that he did not already know. The ledger had done the work he made it for. A hard thing he had learned in a lean year had reached across all the years between them and carried a herd he would never see. 2 seasons on, a young couple down the road lost their own crop to a late frost, and she